Hey guys, tonight we're heading back in time, far back, to the flickering lamplight of a Victorian bedroom where embroidered drapes sway gently in the breeze and the distant clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestone has just faded for the night. You're standing in the corner of a lavish boudoir. The air smells faintly of lavender sachets and paraffin wax. The wallpaper's ornate, the vanity cluttered with mysterious jars, combs, and cloth-bound manuals. But something's off. There, beside a silver brush set, is a shallow porcelain dish. Inside it, 2 perfectly trimmed slices of uncooked veal. Not for dinner, not for the dog, for the face. Because tonight, we're talking about how Victorian ladies prevented wrinkles with raw meat. Now, you probably won't survive this regimen if you try it at home. For one, it's cold, slimy, arguably unsanitary. But in a time without hyaluronic acid or collagen serums, this was just one of many ways women tried to hold back the tide of time, one marbled cutlet at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know who's dozing off across the world with a bit of historical nonsense in their ears. Now, your shoes are off. You've had your cup of tea. The lights are low. Let's walk together into one of the more peculiar corners of 19th century beauty culture, starting with what it meant to chase eternal youth in an era before Botox, before retinol, before indoor plumbing. The Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, was a time of grand contradictions. On one hand, it was an age of prudish modesty and rigid social rules. On the other, it simmered with silent obsessions, chief among them vanity. For the upper class, appearances were destiny. If you were a woman born into wealth, your complexion spoke louder than your words. Pale skin was prized not just for its aesthetic, but for what it implied. That you didn't toil in the sun, didn't sweat for wages, didn't age under duress. Your skin had a job to do. It had to look like it belonged to someone delicate, refined, and ageless. But there was a problem. Time, relentless and uncaring, didn't skip over the wealthy. Wrinkles came, regardless of inheritance, and since women weren't encouraged to have careers, ideas, or independence, their faces became the battleground. Every tiny crease around the eye was a threat. Every fine line at the mouth, a whisper of decline. The pressure was immense. A lady's entire marital and social future could rest upon the appearance of her cheeks, rosy but not too red. Her forehead, smooth but not too shiny. Her neck, firm but not muscled. This wasn't just vanity. It was survival in a social ecosystem where men held the money and women were often ornamental by design. It wasn't unusual for a young woman, say 19 or 20, to start her anti-aging routine before her first ball season. Her mother or governess might pass down an old family trick, a little lamb fat at the temples, or a slap of chilled cream made from goat's milk and lemon peel. Recipes were often passed down like heirlooms, but these early efforts were just the beginning. The older a woman grew, the more elaborate and desperate her attempts became. Which brings us slowly and gently to meat. Yes, actual uncooked meat. Of course, we aren't quite there yet. Before raw meat took its place on the nightstand, women tried every imaginable trick. Some dabbed their faces with lead-based powders. Others wore masks made of linen, soaked in vinegar and rosewater. Still others massaged their cheeks with rough cloth to stimulate the blood, a sort of rudimentary circulation theory that was mostly guesswork. Behind every mirror in every Victorian house, there was an unspoken war on aging, and like all wars, it bred innovation. You imagine now, perhaps, a young lady sitting at her vanity, her maid brushing out her hair. The fire crackles low. A medical booklet, something with a long-winded title like The Domestic Physician's Guide to the Preservation of Beauty and Constitution, lies open nearby. In it, printed in solemn serif font, a recipe. To maintain the elasticity of the countenance and preserve youthfulness, apply nightly a sliver of uncooked beef or veal to the regions of most apparent expression. It doesn't sound appetizing, but back then it sounded like hope. There was logic behind it, or something pretending to be logic. The idea was that raw meat contained life force, freshness, vitality, even cooling properties. It was believed that the enzymes and juices of raw meat could nourish the skin, reduce inflammation, and maintain its tightness. After all, if meat spoiled with time, then surely it could help prevent you from doing the same. You may shudder now, but back then, this was wisdom. And soon, it would become a nightly ritual in some of the grandest homes in London, Bath, or Edinburgh. A ritual you're about to witness up close, with a smile, one slice at a time. You're still in the room. The fire has dwindled to glowing embers, casting soft flickers of orange across the ivory wallpaper. You can hear the faint tick of a long case clock in the hallway. It's just past 9:30 p.m., the accepted bedtime for a respectable lady of the house. You're standing beside her now, watching quietly as she prepares for what she calls the preservation hour. The candles are snuffed, save for one. Her maid, dressed in plain gray with a white cap, has drawn the curtains and laid out the nightgown. But more importantly, she's opened a delicate box from the dresser. Inside, fine muslin cloths, a pewter jar of mutton tallow, and 3 small pieces of raw veal, perfectly trimmed. This is no ordinary skincare routine. This is ritual, almost sacred in its precision. Before meat even touches skin, there's an elaborate cleansing to be done. Victorian beliefs about hygiene were tentative. Germ theory wasn't widely accepted yet, and filth was often seen as moral, not microbial. But when it came to beauty, women erred on the side of cleanliness, at least facially speaking. Tonight, your hostess begins with what she calls a tonic rinse, a bowl of warm water infused with bay leaves and lemon zest. She gently pats her cheeks, then dips a cloth in diluted vinegar and presses it to her temples. You can practically hear the sizzle of sourness against skin. It's not relaxing, but it's trusted. And then, meat. With the delicate care of someone tending to a garden, she picks up a slice. It's cool to the touch, nearly cold. Carefully, she folds it into a piece of muslin, creating a sort of meat compress, then lays it across her forehead. It smells faintly of iron, of butcher's shop, of strange hope. This was no isolated fad. In the second half of the 19th century, women's magazines and household manuals regularly featured tips on using fresh animal tissue to combat sagging or puffiness. Some advised beef for firmness, others swore by veal for delicacy. Pork, curiously, was discouraged, too fatty and besides, unladylike. There were variations. Some women laid the slices directly on their skin. Others used muslin as a barrier to prevent staining the pillowcase. A few wealthier households went further still, having veal specially delivered for facial use only, untouched by kitchen hands, wrapped in waxed linen and stored in a separate drawer of the icebox. A beauty drawer, they called it. Imagine that, a household so committed to wrinkle prevention that it budgets weekly for raw meat not to be eaten, but worn. And in an era without refrigerators in most homes, storing meat safely was an art. For the upper crust, large ice boxes were kept in the pantry and refilled by the iceman every few days. Beneath curls of ice and slabs of salted butter, a small parcel of veal might rest, labeled discreetly with the lady's initials. It must not be mistaken for dinner. That would be dreadfully improper. Back in the room, the lady now applies the second slice, along the jawline, tied gently with a ribbon at the nape of the neck. There's a faint glisten along her cheekbones, the meat reacting to the warmth of her skin. It's not glamorous, but in her mind, it's sacred. The price of poise, the cost of credibility. You may wonder, did it work? Well, there were no clinical trials, no controlled experiments, but there was belief, and belief in beauty often counts for more than evidence. Women who committed nightly to the ritual claimed smoother cheeks. Their maids were told to watch for signs of softening, not of the meat, but of the face. It was a regimen passed from woman to woman. Whispers shared during sewing circles. Quiet nods exchanged in powder rooms. Some women admitted to it openly. Others swore it off in public, only to practice it in private. And while not all embraced the meat mask, many at least considered it, especially those navigating the treacherous social ladder of age. Because the fear wasn't just about looking older. It was about being treated as older, less visible, less valuable. The older a woman grew, the smaller her world became. No more dances, no more invitations, just echoes of youth remembered in the glass. A line on the brow could mean exclusion, a wrinkle, a quiet exile. In this context, a slice of raw veal across the cheek no longer seems quite so absurd. There's another reason it gained traction: pseudoscience. The rise of amateur health manuals in the 1800s led to a glut of advice columns on natural remedies and body rejuvenation. One particularly influential book, The Lady's Physiological Mirror, suggested that meat had cooling properties, ideal for inflammation. Another swore that applying animal essence could replenish one's own. These weren't written by doctors, but that hardly mattered. They sounded convincing, and sometimes sounding confident was all it took. It wasn't just women who were targeted. Male authors and so-called hygiene experts often cashed in on female insecurities. They pitched tonics, devices, even facial muscle exercises with detailed illustrations. The message was clear. Your face is slipping, but don't worry, we have a raw solution for that. And so, night after night, in homes across Britain and parts of America, women would lie back on lace pillows, veal compresses secured to their temples and chins, and pray, softly, silently, that morning would bring youth. In the quiet, you can almost hear the rustle of silk sleeves as our hostess settles into bed, careful not to dislodge her facial cuts. Her maid extinguishes the candle, and the room falls into silence. Sleep, for her, is not merely rest. It is work. Work done with flesh, cloth, and stillness. You begin to wonder what it must have felt like. To go to bed every night, not simply hoping to wake refreshed, but to wake younger. Not with dreams, but with beef. The house is quiet now, except for the creaks of old floorboards settling and the soft hiss of coals in the hearth. Outside, the gas lamps lining the street flicker dimly through the heavy curtains. Inside, your hostess lies still, meat-bound and hopeful, embracing the strange union of sleep and skincare. And here, in the hush of this dim-lit moment, it's time to ask, why meat? Why not something more floral? To understand the logic, or perhaps the lack thereof, you have to first wander back through the peculiar thinking of Victorian science. This was an age perched awkwardly between Enlightenment rationalism and stubborn superstition. On one hand, microscopes were revealing new wonders. On the other, medical books still spoke of miasmas and humors. When it came to skin, Victorians believed a bit of everything: that it could breathe, that it could absorb emotions, that the surface of the face was essentially a membrane for virtue or decay. Doctors, and those who claimed to be, published endless theories about why skin aged. Some pointed to nervous strain, others to overexposure to sunlight or wind. Still others blamed the tightening of facial muscles due to improper etiquette, such as laughing too much or frowning in public. Whatever the cause, the solution always came wrapped in elaborate treatments. And so, to cool the tissues and soothe the pulses, raw meat became a strange but persistent favorite. But this wasn't a completely isolated quirk. The idea of placing meat on the body had existed long before the Victorians. Ancient Egyptians used meat poultices for inflammation. Romans applied pork fat to the skin as a moisturizer. Even medieval apothecaries recommended raw liver for bruises and beef suet for chapped hands. Victorians, with their love of both tradition and novelty, simply blended these ideas with their rising obsession with cosmetic perfection. And let's not forget, this was an era when the line between medicine and beauty was barely visible. A doctor might prescribe mercury for a cough and rose cream for dull skin. It was all part of the same attempt to correct nature's flaws. By the mid-1800s, beauty handbooks were everywhere, small, pocket-sized volumes with titles like The Female Form in Youth and Age, or On the Delicate Management of the Complexion. Inside, you'd find everything from cold cream recipes to eyebrow ink instructions to, you guessed it, recommendations for placing chilled meat upon the face. Some even gave instructions on cut selection: lean beef for oily skin, tender veal for the dry, and a touch of mutton fat for mature complexions. It read more like a butcher's shopping list than a beauty regimen. But for many women, it offered a kind of structure, a method, a sense of control. Still, even the most logical-sounding guidance was often mixed with something else: deep cultural anxiety. Aging wasn't just physical. For Victorian women, it was symbolic. Wrinkles meant diminishing beauty, and diminishing beauty meant diminishing worth. At every turn, society whispered that youth was your currency. And when that currency faded, you paid the price in invisibility. It's no wonder, then, that women turned to extreme methods. They weren't just trying to smooth their cheeks. They were trying to hold their place in the world. You picture now a mother and daughter in their drawing room. The daughter is reading a popular magazine, perhaps The Lady's Companion or Harper's Weekly. She giggles softly and points to a column titled Household Hints for the Skin. There, nestled between tips on removing wine stains and trimming bonnet ribbons, is a paragraph suggesting thin strips of beef as a most agreeable and effective wrinkle tonic. The mother raises her brow, not disapproving, just intrigued. By the end of the week, a parcel arrives from the butcher. Of course, not everyone was so easily persuaded. Some physicians dismissed the meat mask idea as nonsense, or worse, dangerous. Infections weren't understood as they are now, but the notion of putting raw animal product on your face wasn't universally embraced. Critics warned that such practices might cause facial eruptions or disagreeable odors. But these warnings rarely made it past the editorial desk. After all, fear sells, but hope sells better, and the Victorian age was nothing if not an age of hope. Hope in science, in progress, in the notion that anything, even nature itself, could be mastered with enough discipline and restraint. That restraint extended far beyond just the face. Victorian beauty culture was intensely tied to self-control. You didn't just look beautiful. You worked at it, quietly, painfully. Every night was a test of endurance, between the cold compresses, tight corsets, breathy prayers, and of course, the meat. There was a kind of poetry to it in its own strange way. Each woman became both subject and scientist. Her face, a private laboratory. Her vanity, a workstation. Every wrinkle a mystery to be solved. Every product, a promise. Some nights the ritual was lonely. Other nights it was communal. Sisters or cousins might share techniques in whispered tones, giggling over the chill of veal on the brow or the way the smell clung to their hands. Even maids got involved, not as participants, but as quiet co-conspirators. They were the ones who prepped the cloths, trimmed the meat, and cleaned the dishes afterward. Their own faces, of course, received no such treatments. But they watched, and sometimes wondered. You imagine a maid, 22 and sharp-eyed, eyeing the last slice of beef. She hesitates, then, once the lady is asleep, presses it to her own cheek, just for a moment, just to feel, for a breath or two, what it might be like to believe in such things. The meat doesn't work miracles, it never did. But belief, ritual, hope, they do something. They anchor us. They tell us we're trying. That maybe, just maybe, time can be slowed by care, by intention, by a good cut of sirloin and a little faith. And in the stillness of a late Victorian night, with nothing but wind against the window panes, that belief is enough. It's now past midnight. The house sleeps, or pretends to. The lady, nestled in embroidered linens, lies stiff as a painting. You can hear her steady breathing, but her face is locked in perfect stillness, as though any twitch of a cheek muscle might wrinkle what she worked so hard to preserve. Her face is chilled under those neat slices of veal, stitched into muslin like tiny glistening bandages of youth. Let's step softly into the servants' hallway. Past the kitchen, beyond the scullery, there's a narrow pantry. A brass-handled icebox stands tucked beneath a shelf stacked with willow baskets. Most food is stored here: cheese, cream, cooked meats, kept cool by thick slabs of ice delivered twice a week by cart. But in the top right drawer, wrapped in wax paper and tied with string, lies something unusual. It's not dinner. It's not for anyone's plate. It's face meat. The housemaid, bleary-eyed and quietly resentful of her midnight duties, checks it nightly. She inspects the cuts. Are they too dry, too warm? Still fresh enough to serve their purpose? She might dab them with rose water or lemon peel to keep away the sour odor. She doesn't ask questions. She knows better. The term beauty drawer sounds silly now, but it was real. In upper-class homes, where appearances were investments, the icebox became an unlikely extension of the dressing table. Special compartments were allocated not for food, but for flesh. Flesh that would never be eaten, only worn. Some households got creative. Silver trays, porcelain saucers, even cut glass dishes were designated complexion ware. More refined women stored their meat in rose petal infusions or wrapped it in linen embroidered with their initials. You wouldn't dare confuse it with kitchen stock. By the 1870s, butchers in fashionable districts knew what the lady's order meant. It wasn't for stew. It was for skin. Some even offered daintier cuts, small, rounded pieces with minimal marbling. Beauty cuts, they were called in hushed tones, though never advertised. For middle-class women who couldn't afford daily veal, substitutions were made. Leftovers from dinner, trimmed and cooled, were sometimes reused. A little pork from Sunday roast, set aside before cooking. Or lamb, thinned and chilled in the cellar. The smell was stronger, but necessity overruled luxury. The upper class, of course, turned up their noses at this. Theirs was a ritual of elegance. Nothing second-hand. Nothing previously chewed or touched by flame. There's an odd intimacy to the whole thing, really. Placing raw flesh against one's skin, night after night. It wasn't unlike wearing another body, borrowing its vitality. Victorians, though outwardly buttoned up, had a curious comfort with that idea. Animal remedies were common. They wore eels around their necks for headaches, drank bone marrow broth for strength, rubbed goose grease on their chests for colds. The meat mask was simply another logical step, wrapped in linens and manners. Now drift your mind to another house, somewhere in Bath or Brighton, a grand townhouse, owned by a widowed baroness. She's in her 50s, wealthy, well-read, socially respected, but terrified of irrelevance. Every night she applies her slices of veal like armor. not just to soften her skin, but to shield her from the loneliness of becoming invisible. That was the unspoken cruelty of Victorian womanhood. Once you aged, you disappeared. So women fought, quietly, stubbornly, wrapped in gauze and meat. It was not just a beauty act. It was a form of resistance, against time, against fading, against being gently pushed out of view at parties or omitted from invitation lists altogether. The meat mask became a private prayer. Let them still see me. Of course, it wasn't always serious. Some women laughed at the absurdity. Husbands teased their wives gently, calling them the Sunday roast. Children peeked into bedrooms and shrieked at the sight of their mother's mid-mask, looking ghostly and raw. But still, the practice endured. It was passed along in quiet corners, from lady's maid to chambermaid, from older sister to younger cousin. Sometimes as a secret, sometimes as a joke, but always, deep down, as something strangely sacred. And just as sacred was the cleanup. At first light, the ritual reversed itself. The meat, now warm, wilted, sometimes tinged with blood, was peeled away, usually by the maid. It was never reused. To do so was unseemly, and anyway the smell by morning could be ghastly. The used pieces were wrapped in cloth and disposed of, sometimes buried, sometimes burned discreetly with the kitchen refuse. Then came the rinse. Cold water, rose water, or milk, whatever the lady preferred. A bit of powder, just enough to dull the shine. A hint of rouge if she felt pale. By breakfast, she looked radiant. Or at least, she hoped she did. The illusion was complete. And so it went, every day, every week. Sometimes for months, sometimes for years.
And all the while, the icebox drawer stayed full. Always ready, always waiting. It's fascinating, isn't it, how effort hides behind elegance? The face presented to the world so fresh, so natural, was supported by hours of nightly effort, all behind the scenes. And meat, of all things, became a cornerstone of that facade. You may find it grotesque, or oddly poetic, or both. But in the end, it was just another way to say, I am still young. I am still here. And now, with the house stirring again and morning peeking at the lace-draped windows, the lady rises. The meat is gone. Her skin perhaps smoother, or maybe just colder. But her confidence? Reassembled. She faced the day with poise. And tonight, she'd do it all again.